Hello, everyone. Just going to give a minute or two for people to join us online. Hi, everybody. Just waiting a minute or two to let folks join online. If you're just tuning in, again, I'm just waiting another minute or so to let people join in. This will be a fairly short one, so I don't want people to miss anything. So hello to everyone who's already signed in. Hello to Kimberly Henshaw, R.C. Tatum Reese, Eileen Rivera. Hey, Marilyn. And hi, Lucy. Lucy's our PR person. Thank you, APT. All right, folks, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm Dean Knight. I'm the Tours and Memberships Coordinator at the Poe Museum in Richmond, Virginia, in Shockoe Bottom. If you have joined me before, either in person in the Enchanted Garden at the museum or virtually during one of my many Sunday readings over the past 4 years or so, then you'll know, of course, that I do readings of Poe's work, his stories, and his poems in the Enchanted Garden, specifically in the Poe Shrine, which is a wonderful structure created out of the bricks from the Southern Literary Messenger, which was where Poe had his first job on the staff of a literary magazine. Today, of course, I'm not coming to you from the Poe Museum at all, although I'm not too far away, actually. Of course, as we all know, we're all practicing social distancing in the age of the coronavirus, COVID-19. And so I am in my home, and I'm going to read you a few poems. I want to tell you, first of all, that I've been to the museum a couple times over the past week or so. I live pretty close, and one of those times was to feed the cats, and they're doing very well. So Pluto and Edgar say hi to all of their many fans. I gave them some time to run around, and they seem to enjoy seeing me, and especially to enjoy eating, which is usually why they enjoy seeing me. So. But they definitely seriously miss having lots of people around. That's obvious. They love that. So the cats are doing fine, and we hope that you all are too in this unusual time that we're living through. So I have picked out 4 poems to read today, and I decided to pick a few poems that have some sort of connection to what we're all going through now, to social distancing, or being alone or lonely, or just alone and not necessarily lonely. I'm going to read a poem called The Lake, which I've never read before, at least aloud. I'm going to read Alone, fittingly. I'm going to read Eulalie, and I'm going to read To Helen. To Helen is probably the most famous of these poems, and I'll talk a bit more about it when I get to it. I'll read that one last. And it also has probably the least connection to being alone, but that's all right. It's still a great poem. And the other, Eulalie, is from the 1840s. That's right in Poe's prime. But the first 2 that I'm going to read are very early. Poe started out as a poet. He didn't start writing short stories until he moved to Baltimore in 1831, and by that time he'd already published 3 small books of poetry, and he definitely and always thought of himself as a poet, as many writers do who start with poetry, whether they're successful or not, and then turn to short stories, novels, plays, whatever. Poe always saw himself as a poet, and of course, quite rightly, he never stopped writing poetry. Some of his most popular and famous poems were written so late in his life that they weren't published until after his death. The Bells and Annabel Lee. That's also true of Alone, which is the second poem that I'm going to read. The first one I'd like to read today is called The Lake. And again, this is very early from the 1820s. And here it is, The Lake. In spring of youth it was my lot to haunt of the wide earth a spot, the which I could not love the less. So lovely was the loneliness of a wild lake with black rock bound and the tall pines that towered around. But when the night had thrown her pall upon that spot as upon all, and the mystic wind went by murmuring in melody, then, then I would awake to the terror of the lone lake. Yet that terror was not fright, but a tremulous delight, a feeling not the jeweled mind could teach or bribe me to define, nor love, although the love were thine. Death was in that poisonous wave, and in its gulf a fitting grave for him who thence could solace bring to his lone imagining, whose solitary soul could make an Eden of that dim lake. And that is The Lake. The next one I'd like to read is a poem called Alone, which is, I think, a bit better known than The Lake, which is not very well known at all. Alone, Poe apparently wrote it in an autograph album in the 1820s and never published it. It was published in 1875, which is pretty amazing, especially since this poem has several lines that are fairly well known. I don't believe it's among his very best poems, but it obviously serves our theme today, and it definitely speaks to many of Poe's themes that he revisits throughout his life. And for those who are interested in Poe's life, I think this one might be a bit more telling than some of the others. Of course, working at the museum and knowing about Poe, I often get questions about Poe's life and how much his life is in his work, and I sometimes sort of steer away from that a little bit because he's an imaginative writer. He's a creative writer. Certainly he uses his life, but it's not necessarily directly reproduced in his work. But I don't know, this one might be something of an exception. Alone. From childhood's hour I have not been as others were. I have not seen as others saw. I could not bring my passions from a common spring. From the same source I have not taken my sorrow. I could not awaken my heart to joy at the same tone. And all I loved alone. Then, in my childhood, in the dawn of a most stormy life was drawn from every depth of good and ill the mystery which binds me still. From the torrent or the fountain, from the red cliff of the mountain, from the sun that round me rolled in its autumn tint of gold, from the lightning in the sky as it passed me flying by, from the thunder and the storm and the cloud that took the form, when the rest of heaven was blue, of a demon in my view. All right, so next I'd like to read Eulalie. And again, I think this is a beautiful poem. It's, I guess, somewhat well known, but maybe not as well known as it should be or could be. I didn't know this poem very well until somewhat recently when I did sort of a joint presentation, actually in one of those Sunday readings with Dr. Amy Armiento, who is currently the president of the Poe Studies Association. Eulalie, a song, is the actual title of it. And Poe did this a few times. Of course, with poetry, poems are always meant to be read and heard aloud. And with Poe, that's especially true of a number of his poems. Again, this one's subtitled A Song. Eulalie, which is one of my possibly my favorite of his poems, is subtitled A Ballad. Poe always paid strict, close attention to rhythm and meter in everything. The raven is probably the standout in this. He was extremely proud of the raven because he created this very unique metrical structure, but maybe that'll be for another day. This is Eulalie, a song. I dwelt alone in a world of moan, and my soul was a stagnant tide, till the fair and gentle Eulalie became my blushing bride, till the yellow-haired young Eulalie became my smiling bride. Ah, less bright, the stars of the night, than the eyes of the radiant girl, and never a flake that the vapor can make with the moon tints of purple and pearl can vie with the modest Eulalie's most unregarded curl, can compare with the bright-eyed Eulalie's most humble and careless curl. Now doubt, now pain, come never again, for her soul gives me sigh for sigh, and all day long shines bright and strong, Astarte within the sky, while ever to her dear Eulalie upturns her matron eye, while ever to her young Eulalie upturns her violet eye. All right, so I'd like to close out with To Helen. And again, To Helen may not fit quite as closely with the solitary theme of today, but it's one of his very best poems, I think, and one of his best known. Because it wouldn't be Poe without some confusion sometimes, I think. He wrote two poems called To Helen. The famous one is the earlier one. That's the one I'm going to read right now. It was inspired and written for a woman named Jane Stannard, who was the mother of a childhood friend of Poe's. And for those of you who live here in Richmond or are familiar with Richmond, Jane Stannard lived on 9th Street, just across the street from the state capitol. And Poe was stunned by her from the moment he saw her. He said he was speechless for many minutes after the first time he saw her. Jane went insane and died, and that's pretty much what we know. When Poe was, I believe, 14, maybe 15, she was 30, and he and her son would visit her at her grave at Shockoe Hill Cemetery. He certainly wrote this poem for her. Again, her name wasn't Helen, her name was Jane, but I think the idea is that he's comparing her to Helen of Troy, who of course was the most beautiful woman in the ancient world, supposedly the cause of the Trojan War, and so on. And so that's what he's doing. And the most famous lines in this short poem are, to the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome. And so the glory that was Greece is generally seen as an allusion to Helen of Troy, who was the glory of Greece, stolen by the Trojans. The grandeur that was Rome is sometimes seen as possibly an allusion to the Virginia state capitol. Again, she, Jane, not Helen of Troy, lived across the street from the Virginia state capitol. And the state capitol is an extraordinary building. It is quite literally a Roman temple, architecturally, and it is. Thomas Jefferson was the one who was in charge of building it. What Jefferson did was he picked an ancient Roman temple in Nîmes, France, to be the model for the new state capitol here in Virginia. And this was an extraordinary move. It was a great departure from any other building in North America at this time. We can lose sight of that now, especially those of us who live on the East Coast, and we know Richmond, Washington, D.C., which is full of buildings like that. But the state capitol was the first. Again, it is, I think it's the first neoclassical building in the New World, I believe. So the grandeur that was Rome may well be a reference to that. Anyway, to Helen. Helen, thy beauty is to me like those Nicean barks of yore, that gently o'er a perfumed sea the weary, way-worn wanderer bore to his own native shore. On desperate seas long wont to roam, thy hyacinth hair, thy classic face, thy naiad airs have brought me home to the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome. Lo, in yon brilliant window niche, how statue-like I see thee stand, the agate lamp within thy hand. Ah, Psyche, from the regions which are Holy Land. And that is it. That is To Helen. All right, so usually at the conclusion of something like this, I'd say, come visit us. I can't do that right now, but hopefully we'll we'll probably do a few more of these. But thanks for visiting with me virtually. I appreciate it, and hope to see you all in person sometime in the not too distant future, I would hope. Thanks again.